Welcome back to Teaching Through the Bible as we look at the cleansing in Leviticus chapter 14. So in chapter 14, we see this cleansing that goes on as a continuation from chapter 13. There are ways to become unclean, and how do we solve that? So something to really notice here that's we kind of see it back in chapter 13, but we continue to see emphasized here, is how the priest must be the one to declare clean. You don't get to do it yourself. You don't get to decide on your own what the rules are or what works for you. The priest is the one to declare that. Just like Jesus is the one who determines being clean in a spiritual sense. In chapter 14 here, when it talks about the houses, we see chapter 14, beginning in verse 33, it starts talking about these houses that may have mold or mildew, something like that. And it says with these houses that you go and tell the priest. Verse 35, then he who owns the house shall come and tell the priest, there seems to me to be some case of disease in my house. Then the priest shall, and it goes on and explains what the priest does. The priest is the one to determine this, not the individual. So that's just one thing to notice throughout this chapter. But before that, before going on to the mold and mildew of houses and that uncleanness, we have the people. We have leprosy, it says. What you see is translated leprosy there. That's really much more broad, more general than that. It doesn't mean that it could not have included leprosy in a human. They weren't necessarily aware of that particular disease, but could have been there. It's just not specifically what's being talked about there. So it's included in that group. It's not the entirety of the group of what's being talked about here. So these various diseases we have in chapter 14, what can we see from this? We see a pattern of 7 days. So you have this process of determining if someone has this disease, and if they do, then you have this process of being cleansed from this disease. And these oftentimes, the time periods here involve 7 days. The 7 is the number of completeness in the Bible. 7 is a full week. And so this completeness is important here. That's what the imagery is getting at, this completeness that we see. And so it's on the 8th day that they are then finally declared clean. We can also see that it talks about the end of the day. We talked about the day beginning in the evening, how they had a day evening to morning, and throughout the remainder of that day ends in the evening. So that's when a new day begins. So don't forget that part as well. We have a very interesting start to chapter 14, though, when we talk about how someone can be ritually cleansed of their disease. So they're declared unclean as long as they have leprosy, and there's nothing they can do about it. There's no way to fix that. There's no way to heal that that they can do. The Bible doesn't describe, hey, if you get leprosy or any of these diseases, then go ahead and do X, Y, and Z, and then it'll be healed. There's no way. There's no solution on their own. But if they do become healed, if that does end up happening, they bring themselves to the priest. And in fact, we see this with Jesus when he heals those who have leprosy. He tells them, all right, you go on to the priest, show yourselves to the priest. All right, so that's still going on even in Jesus' day, which also is interesting to give us this indication that Jesus lived in the Old Testament period, that during Jesus' life, before he died and rose again for our sins, the Old Testament way of doing things still applied. Jesus still followed through with that until he accomplished what he needed to do in order to be the complete fulfillment of what all this stuff's pointing to. And we see some of what it is pointing to when we look at some things that may look really odd at first, for sure. We have this process where it says in verse 4, so this is still chapter 14, verse 4, the priest shall command them to take for him who is to be cleansed, 2 live, clean birds, and cedar wood, and scarlet yarn, and hyssop. And the priest shall command them to kill one of the birds in an earthenware vessel over fresh water. Now, this word for fresh water is actually the same word when we see a live bird, fresh water. They're both the word living. So live bird, living water. That living water means running water. So it's not stagnant. It's not staying still. It's running water. So over running water, over fresh water. So you get this vessel. You have, I guess, running water under it here, and over that you are killing this bird, and blood is going in there. So that's how the process begins. And when you've got that vessel, you've got the blood in there from the one bird, but you have another bird. And it says you're taking scarlet yarn, you're taking cedar wood, and hyssop. Hyssop is a kind of plant that is probably Syrian oregano, if you care to look that up, what Syrian oregano is. But basically, you've got this plant, and it's used in cleansing processes in the Old Testament. So you have these 3 things, and it says that he shall take the live bird with the cedar wood and the scarlet yarn and the hyssop, so the bird with those 3 things, and dip them and the live bird in the blood of the bird that was killed over the fresh water. Take all that stuff, dip it in the blood. Interesting little tidbit here. For those of y'all who care about the language, this in the Greek translation is baptizo, dipping it in. So you could say they're baptized in it. Now, there's not a full immersion, obviously. Some people kind of think of that word as only meaning full immersion. It can. Baptizing can be full immersion. But this word baptizo is more broad than that. It doesn't have to be full immersion. The word is used here, and you clearly can't fully immerse an animal in the blood, just simply the blood of the other animal, the same thing. But so you take that live bird, you have the blood of the dead bird, you take the live bird with these other elements, dip it in the blood of the other bird, and then after sprinkling the cleansed person, the person who's going to be cleansed with this blood, then the live bird goes free. What do we see there? What do you think that means? The bird who was sacrificed, the bird whose blood is in the bowl, that's Jesus. Jesus was the one that died. And that other bird, the one that was still alive, was baptized in the blood of that dead bird and was made free. It's such a cool example when we can see what these things symbolized, what is going on in Leviticus. If you just read this passage and you're not thinking too hard into it, and you see what's going on, take this bird and you kill it, and blood, and you have these things that you're sticking in there, and what's going on here, but when you understand it's all pointing to Jesus, then we get to see what the point is. It can make so much more sense to us. And there's other levels to this too, potentially. So when you have hyssop, you have wood, you have the scarlet yarn. Some people will think that scarlet yarn, that's red, maybe that's representative of blood as well. Perhaps having these 3 representative things, okay? Scarlet yarn, wood, and hyssop. Well, when we see Jesus' sacrificial death on the cross, a few things we see there. He was sacrificed on a piece of wood. His blood was given out. And there's hyssop actually there as well. I believe that's in the Gospel according to John. It says they took this hyssop, they stuck some stuff on the edge of the hyssop and handed it up to Jesus when he said he was thirsty. And so you have there something that perhaps prefigures what's going on with Jesus in Leviticus 14, kind of giving you an idea of the crucifixion even there. Now, of course, we have to be careful to not go all over the place with what we call typology, with seeing one thing and then in the Old Testament pointing forward to another thing. We have some people, even church fathers, from hundreds of years ago, even over 1,000 years ago, saying things like that the four legs of the tabernacle, or of the table within the tabernacle, represent the four Gospels. Now, that, we're kind of getting really far out there with that. One way that we can be sure that we're reining in the interpretation and making sure we're not really going way out there is all of these things are going to be pointing to Jesus. Okay, this is all about Jesus. If we see something in the Old Testament that's just pointing us to a book of the Bible, right, like the four Gospels, or it's talking about someone else in the New Testament, Peter, Mary, John, any of these other people, is it pointing to them in relation to Jesus, or is it just pointing to them as somebody else who's going to be coming in the New Testament? Because then we're starting to get kind of out there. So we got to make sure, is this really teaching us about Jesus? Is it pointing us to him? Or are we just kind of starting to really make connections that are a little too tenuous, that aren't really based in what we're seeing of just finding things everywhere, even when they're not? So we got to be careful they're not going too far out there with that. But this is an interpretation as far as like the hyssop, the cedar wood, the scarlet yarn that some people take as far as pointing at Jesus. We also see scarlet yarn in another place in the Bible where we see it with Jericho. And we'll talk about that when we get there, but some people will again interpret that as representing blood, representing Jesus' blood that saves us, and perhaps you can see it there. We'll talk about that once we get to the book of Joshua, get to the events of Jericho. But here, just in these first few verses of chapter 14, we've already seen certainly that the one bird is sacrificed, the other bird baptized in the blood of the dead bird, and is then able to be free. We, the unclean people, are identified with that live bird who's able to be freed. So that's a great gospel message right there at the beginning of Leviticus 14. And this process continues, though. You have sacrifices for the person who's being made clean, and then you have something that's really similar to what we saw earlier with the priests, where the priests were made clean. What they had to do, they took blood, they put it on the right thumb, the right earlobe, and the right big toe. Boom. They did that with blood, and here they even do that with the oil. Now, that oil was used for the priests. It was put on their heads, but not necessarily like on these exact same spots. Like here, we have it on the earlobe, the thumb, the big toe. Not very flexible. But that is something that we see here that is representing the covering of their whole body in blood. Their whole body wasn't literally covered over in blood. They didn't dump a whole thing of blood on them. But these right extremities being something that was representative for the whole. So their whole body. They are needing to be washed in the blood, just as the bird was baptized in that blood. So here we see this further ritual of what's going on. It continues to tell us about Jesus, and then we actually see these things going on in, as I said, the New Testament. This was in Matthew 8, where Jesus cleansed some people of leprosy, told them, go ahead to the priests, continue to follow that regulation. And so that's just something that we can look to in the New Testament. We see this still being fulfilled. Before we get on to the rest of chapter 14 is basically Once we get through that, it's talking about houses. This is not just people. This is houses. There's so many ways that God is showing this picture. The houses, you notice that they have to tear parts out of the houses if there's more mold and mildew. And then you see if it still grows, and it does, you eventually destroy the house. And so Jesus does something that's kind of another picture for that, when he goes and he kind of flips over tables. He goes to the temple and he cleans house. The temple, that house, God's house, there is evil in it, and he cleanses that out. But of course, he says it's going to be destroyed, right? And it's destroyed because it continues to have that evil, even after it's been torn out of it initially. He's cleansed that part of it, but it continues to be there. It continues to grow, and so it is totally destroyed, just as a house in Leviticus 14 has to be totally destroyed. So we see that these are example after example that are giving us a picture here. And this is another picture. The house thing may seem really strange, what they have to do and not do and stuff, but it's all about being holy with God, holy for him, separated for him, to worship him. And that's where we're going to leave it right here at the end of chapter 14 before we move on to some icky bodily discharges and stuff in the next section. Thank you for watching that video. I hope that it helped you learn a little bit more about the Bible today. And if you'd like to continue to learn more about the Bible, then we have plenty of other videos on the channel. And if this has been helpful for you, then you can always let me know by subscribing to the channel. And hopefully I'll be able to continue to help you learn even more about God's Word. Thanks.